So, back in 1998, I was just 14 and living in Wakefield in the UK. I liked football, I liked my mom's shepherd's pie, and I liked throwing sticks for our dog down at the park. What I didn't like most people, was school. I couldn't stand it, in fact. But I had my best mate, Callum Reed, to get me through the day there. Me and Callum Reed used to get the bus together at the end of school. And no matter how bad my day had been, he always found a way to cheer me up. At least until one day, when Callum Reed was suddenly the one who needed cheering up. Callum Reed was a good lad. He was never late for school. He did all of his homework on time, and he generally kept himself out of trouble. Then, one day, while walking out of the North Wing lavatories, Callum Reed accidentally bumped into a teacher named Mr. Hargreaves, sending hot tea all over the front of Carter's nice white shirt. Callum Reed apologized, but Mr. Hargreaves was absolutely livid. Carter acted like he'd done it on purpose and sent Callum Reed straight to Behavioral Review Unit, which was even worse than being given immediate detention. He then told the school's head teacher that Callum Reed had deliberately spilled a scalding hot drink all over him. This elevated the seriousness of the incident to a health and safety issue, where somebody could have been seriously hurt. As a result, the head teacher wanted Callum Reed expelled. Callum Reed's parents basically begged the head teacher not to expel him. In the end, they managed to whittle the punishment down to 2 weeks of hourly after-school detention, including 2 hours on Saturday mornings. They said they believed Callum Reed hadn't meant to hurt Mr. Hargreaves, but being fully aware of how unfair life could be, they advised him to keep his mouth shut, take the punishment, and put it behind him. Callum Reed's brother, on the other hand, wasn't quite so philosophical about it. Marcus Reed, who was almost 3 years older than us, wanted revenge. Although he'd never been personally picked on by him, Marcus Reed had hated Mr. Hargreaves during his own time at school, and seeing his little brother treated so unfairly sent him right around the bend. While he promised that we would get Carter back, he told us that revenge was a dish best served cold. At the time, I had no idea what he meant by that. So Marcus Reed explained himself. If we rode our bikes past Mr. Hargreaves' house that very same day and pelted it with 24 rotten eggs, he'd know who it was right away. But if you waited a couple of months and made him think you were all good and sorry and all of that, he'd have no bloody idea who it was. On top of that, Carter would have even less of an idea who egged his house if we did something on a night of the year when all sorts of things like that were happening. That night was Devil's Eve. Now, for those that don't know, and to be fair, I didn't really know this myself until I Googled it. Devil's Eve is a tradition that stretches back hundreds of years. Historically, it's taken place on different days of the year, depending on which part of the world you're in. But the premise is always the same. The night before some kind of religious festival, kids take to the streets to carry out acts of mischief. In the distant past, that mischief involved stealing cabbages from nearby farms. But more recently, in places like the United Kingdom and America, kids throw eggs or sometimes whole rolls of toilet paper over houses and trees until they're completely covered. It used to take place on the 30th of April. Then, at one point in parts of England, it happened on the night before Guy Fawkes Night. But these days, on both sides of the Atlantic, the date seems to have settled on the 30th of October, the night before Halloween. And it was this night that Marcus Reed picked for our revenge. Another reason Marcus Reed told us to be patient was so he could work out a way of really hurting Mr. Hargreaves. Now, I don't mean hurting him physically. Marcus Reed was a good lad, like his brother, so the thought of actually harming the guy never seriously crossed his mind. But we needed a way of getting back at him for picking on Callum Reed the way he did, and that wasn't going to work with just a few eggs or some toilet paper. It was weeks before Marcus Reed came up with something. But then, one afternoon, Marcus Reed shared his idea with us. by gum, it seemed like a good one. Mr. Hargreaves was heavily into classic cars as well, so much so that he'd invested a hell of a lot of money into a first series 1962 Aston Martin DB4 that he kept locked away in his garage. That car was his pride and joy, the thing that got him out of bed in the morning, and we were going to wreck it. It was early October when we started planning, but right from the beginning, we knew it wouldn't be easy. We couldn't just break in during the small hours of the morning. Mr. Hargreaves or a neighbor would wake up and call the police. So we talked through some quieter options. We thought about slashing the car's leather seats or spray painting Carter as a knob down the side of it. But that just wasn't going to cut it for Marcus Reed. He wanted Carter to suffer. I mean, really suffer. And a deeply embittered Callum Reed signed off on whatever he came up with. So we got creative. The first phase of the plan involved asking one of Marcus Reed's mates to do us a favor. Or more like 24 favors, really. Almost every night for about 3 weeks, Marcus Reed's mate Marvin would ride over to Mr. Hargreaves' house, and after knocking on the door as loudly as he could, he'd jump back on his bike and ride off. He would give us little reports on it too, about how Carter was getting angrier and angrier every time it happened. And by the time Devil's Eve came around, Carter had taken to charging down the street after a frantically pedaling Marvin, screaming that he would give him a bloody good hiding once he got his hands on him. Now everything was going according to plan, or at least according to Marcus Reed it was. All we had to do was wait until Devil's Eve, and we would make Mr. Hargreaves suffer big time. And on the morning of the 30th, I was buzzing with excitement. All the kids at school were asking each other what they were getting up to that night, and both Callum Reed and I had to put on poker faces when we said, not much, just keeping out of trouble. Neither of us had any classes with Mr. Hargreaves, but I saw him in the corridor at one point, and I swear I felt the color drain from my face as we passed each other. I got it into my head that if he saw me looking shifty, he would know we were up to something. So I was hugely relieved when 3:15 rolled around and it was time to go home. As Callum Reed and I walked to the bus stop, we went over that evening's plan of action. Marcus Reed had everything organized and planned out meticulously. All I had to do was show up at their place at 7 p.m. When I told Callum Reed I was nervous, he said he felt the same way. But he also thanked me for helping out and told me I was the best friend he had ever had. Even if I had been harboring serious doubts, that last line would have wiped them out completely. And so, needless to say, there was no turning back after that. A couple of hours later, all 4 of us were just around the corner from Mr. Hargreaves' house. Riding together like that, with the 2 older lads, all my nerves fell away behind me, and I was keen as mustard to knock 7 shades of crap out of Mr. Hargreaves, his old Aston. We hid our bikes down the street behind a car as Marvin crept up Carter's path. Then, after banging on the front door, Marvin ran back toward the street and climbed onto his bike. But instead of pedaling off right away, he waited until Carter had opened the front door. Then he shouted, "Catch me if you can, tosspot!" and started pedaling like mad. Carter went berserk. Marvin had told us how angry the knock and dash was making him, but seeing it for ourselves was something else entirely. He screamed something we could not make out and then ran for his car, not the Aston, but his everyday car. And after wildly backing out of his driveway, he sped off down the road in pursuit of Marvin. We were elated. The plan had worked perfectly, but we also knew we only had about 15 minutes before Carter returned home. Marvin said it had gotten to the point where Carter would chase him in his car, and after Marvin easily escaped using the neighborhood's alleyways, Carter would drive up and down the streets looking for him for a while. We wasted no time putting on our gloves and running up Carter's driveway toward the garage. Marcus Reed then pulled a towel from his bag, and after Callum Reed held it against the small side window, he punched through so it broke cleanly and quietly. Marcus Reed knocked out the rest of the glass and laid the towel over the bottom of the frame. Then we climbed inside before someone turned on the light. But when the light came on, there was no bloody car. We couldn't believe it. This was a wide-open space where the car used to be, but for some reason, it just wasn't there. Months of planning had amounted to nothing, and even if we managed to break a few windows or trample his flower beds, it wouldn't be nearly as satisfying as smashing the Aston. I remember suggesting that we just leave and maybe break one of Carter's front windows on the way out. Callum Reed said that wasn't a bad idea, but Marcus Reed wanted nothing to do with it. He said there had to be something in that garage we could break or steal that would really get to Mr. Hargraves, and he wasn't leaving until we found it. Even Callum Reed thought it was a bit much, and that we'd end up getting caught if we stayed too long. But Marcus Reed had already picked something out. There was a footlocker, the old military kind with a padlock, and as soon as Callum Reed pointed it out, I knew exactly what he was thinking. Inside would be Carter's old Army and Navy belongings, precious artifacts from his time in the forces. He'd be devastated if anything like that went missing. So that's what we were going to take. There was a pair of rusty bolt cutters mounted on a nearby tool rack. After Marcus Reed took them down, he and Callum Reed went to work clipping the padlock off the footlocker. I remember how loud the bolt cutters sounded when they finally snapped through. Then Marcus Reed and Callum Reed crouched down, flipped open the lid, and started rummaging through the footlocker's contents. Looking over their shoulders, all I could see were white envelopes. At first, I thought they might contain money since they looked stuffed. But inside were only pages of handwritten letters. There were a few pieces of jewelry, and Callum Reed stuffed them into his pockets. But then, Marcus Reed pulled out a framed photograph of a young woman, along with a small glass jar containing a lock of brown hair. I remember thinking the girl must have been Carter's niece or something, because he didn't have a family as far as we knew. But after looking at the photo for a few seconds, Marcus Reed dropped it back into the locker like it was radioactive. Callum Reed asked him what the matter was, and Marcus Reed told him to put the jewelry back immediately. Callum Reed asked why, but Marcus Reed just walked toward the broken window and told us we needed to leave. Callum Reed started giving it loads about not leaving without getting Carter back, but Marcus Reed growled, "No, Callum Reed," to let us know how serious he was. We hopped out of the window, grabbed the towel, and then ran out into the street toward where we'd stashed our bikes. The last thing Marcus Reed said was, "Follow me, and don't stop until I do." And then we rode like hell until Marcus Reed finally slowed down. Now we were all out of breath, legs burning from the wild pedaling we had just done. Me and Callum Reed were still completely confused about why Marcus Reed had suddenly reacted the way he did. We wanted to know what had scared him so much about a picture of a girl. But it wasn't the girl. It was what happened to her that scared him. Like I mentioned, Marcus Reed was a couple of years older than us, so there were a few things he remembered, odds and ends from just before mine and Callum Reed's time. One of those things involved a young lady who went missing on Rombald's Ridge. He told us there had been a big search for her, and that her picture had been all over the local papers around the time she disappeared. The girl in the photo frame in Carter's footlocker looked almost exactly like the girl who had gone missing. Callum Reed started arguing the toss, asking his brother if he was sure it was the same girl, but Marcus Reed was certain. He told us how no one had ever found a body. She was only assumed to be dead, but he was absolutely, positively, 110% sure it was the same girl in the photo, and that the lock of hair and those pieces of jewelry had almost certainly belonged to her. I couldn't believe it, in the sense that I genuinely couldn't process what I was hearing. I didn't think Marcus Reed was lying or making anything up, but it felt like my brain simply refused to accept the information. I kept thinking there had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe the missing girl was related to Carter in some way, and what we'd seen was nothing more than a keepsake. But Marcus Reed wasn't an idiot, and he wasn't a coward either. He wouldn't have dragged us up to Carter's garage unless he was deadly serious about it. Even so, I couldn't bring myself to accept what he was suggesting. It only became real once we reached a phone box outside a row of shops, and Marcus Reed stepped inside, called 999, and anonymously reported Carter for what we'd found in his footlocker. He didn't explain how he knew the jewelry and the lock of hair were there, only that he'd seen them with his own eyes. After giving Carter's address, he hung up, and we rode off again. That was when it finally sank in what had happened that night. The police report made it real. And just like when Callum Reed said I was his best friend, there was no going back now. We expected police cars outside Carter's house within hours, maybe even a helicopter and a TV crew. Instead, it was just a single police constable knocking on his door, taking a brief look through his garbage, and then leaving again, satisfied there was nothing to worry about. It was only then that we realized what was meant to be a deadly serious report had been dismissed as nothing more than some Devil's Eve nonsense. Breaking into Carter's garage and then into his footlocker had also given him advance warning that someone had uncovered what might have been his deepest, darkest secret. By the time a policeman was poking around his garbage, he'd likely scrubbed the place from top to bottom and hidden the footlocker again, if he hadn't disposed of it entirely. In the weeks that followed, I kept expecting Carter to be arrested at any moment. I couldn't even bring myself to look in his direction, afraid that one glance at my face would tell him it was us who broke into his garage. Marcus Reed kept telling us to be patient, saying that investigations took time, and that Carter would eventually be arrested. But he never was. Nothing ever happened. Or rather, the only thing that happened was that Carter got away with it. And just after Christmas, once we were all back at school, there was an announcement during assembly. Carter was leaving, not for another school somewhere in England, but to teach at an international school in Hong Kong. The head teacher treated it like Carter was moving up in the world, heading off on some grand adventure to the Orient. Only me, Callum Reed, and Marcus Reed, and Marvin knew the real reason Carter was moving. We talked about it once or twice, and Callum Reed mentioned something about extradition. He did not know the word for it at the time. He just asked about the possibility of Hong Kong handing Carter over once his crimes came to light. But then Marcus Reed shared his theory on why Carter had chosen Hong Kong over almost anywhere else in the world. It might have been an ex-British colony, and it might have still had plenty of English-speaking institutions, but Hong Kong had been handed over to China the previous year. If it was no longer British territory, and since the UK did not have an extradition treaty with China, Carter would not have to return home. Even if they found a smoking gun on his property, there was nothing the police or the government could do to bring him to justice. And the worst part was that it was all our fault. By breaking into that footlocker, all we had done was give him advance warning. He might have come across her at some point, and if the police had raided his house, they would have found the same thing we did. But any chance of that happening was scuppered the moment we decided to cut the padlock off. Smash his car, and maybe the police find the footlocker while they are following up on a vandalism report. But by making an anonymous report on Devil's Eve of all the bloody nights, all we really did was make sure Carter could escape justice. And to this day, I still feel this deep twinge of shame and regret. Marcus Reed had it the worst, with it being his idea. He got mad and turned to booze as he got older, and he was an out-of-work alcoholic by the time he was 30. People thought he was just a loser, someone who could not deal with the everyday working world. But me and Callum Reed were no different, because it was the same shame and guilt we only barely managed to fight off that ended up completely consuming him. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Years later, my family moved to the United States, and by the time I was grown, I was living in Texas. I grew up in a place called Shallow Water, a little northwest Texas town about 10 miles outside of Leach. When I was 19, I had a job at the XFAB plant, and I used to get a ride to work with a couple of coworkers. Every morning, we would stop at this little coffee place called Hebrews to get a few cups of go juice, and it was there that I met a girl named Lena Morales. We got to talking about the donuts and which ones were our favorites. And then, after confirming she was single, we swapped phone numbers and started texting back and forth. We went on a couple of dates throughout October, and then toward the end of the month. And with Halloween coming up, I asked Lena Morales if she had any plans for it. And she said that she was heading to a Halloween party up toward the country club, and that if I wanted to go, I could tag along with her and her friends. At the time, I was completely taken with this girl, and none of my friends had any plans beyond sitting at home, probably playing PUBG. So I figured, why not? I put together a simple ghost face costume, the same one I had worn a couple of years earlier. I used the chance to show Lena Morales that I actually had some social skills by getting along with her friends. It turned into a pretty fun night, at least until Lena Morales went to the bathroom and came back moments later with a worried look on her face. She said her ex had shown up out of nowhere. He was supposed to be away working on oil rigs in the Gulf, but plans had changed, and that meant I needed to leave. In short, Lena Morales' ex was a jerk, and if I stayed, there would definitely be a fight once he figured out who she was with. I didn't want to leave, but I also didn't want to fight him. So I said goodbye to Lena Morales and her friends, and figured I could slip out without any trouble. Right as I was walking down the driveway of that big old house, I heard someone yelling behind me, telling me to get out of there before he kicked my ass. I looked over my shoulder and saw some angry-looking guy being held back by his equally obnoxious friends, still shouting at me as I turned out of the driveway and onto the road. I planned to walk back to Shallow Water, which would take a couple of hours, but I didn't mind. I was too obsessed to care about the distance, and thoughts of Lena Morales kept me warm until my phone suddenly buzzed in my pocket. It was Lena Morales, and she said her ex was furious. After starting another fight, he and his friends had been kicked out of the party. They were angry, and they planned to catch up with me so they could beat me up. I had a bad feeling in my gut, and once I realized they were driving while I was on foot, I knew it was only a matter of time before they found me. I had lost my ghost face mask at the party, but I was still wearing that tattered black gown as I started jogging along the side of the highway. Looking back, it seems stupid, but at the time I couldn't think of anything else to do. I needed to get home, or at least get far enough away to make it harder for Lena Morales' ex and his friends to find me. So there I was, jogging down the highway in my Halloween costume. Every so often, I looked over my shoulder at approaching cars, silently hoping none of them belonged to Lena Morales' ex. One by one, they passed me, until a car slowed down beside me. I thought that was it. I turned, expecting a car full of guys ready to beat me down, but instead, it was a lone woman who rolled down her passenger window and asked if I needed a ride. She looked like your typical soccer mom in her SUV and purple sweater, and followed up by saying that she figured if I was running along the side of the road, I most likely needed a ride someplace. And I told her that she was a godsend, that I had never needed a ride so badly in my entire life. And then, after making sure she was headed my way, I hopped into the passenger seat and we took off down the road. She introduced herself as Marilyn Cross and asked why I had been running down the side of the road in the first place. I didn't know what else to tell her, so I told her the truth. I told her all about Lena Morales, how her ex had shown up at the Halloween party we were at, and how I was running because she texted me saying he was out to kick my butt. I also tied that into why I was so grateful that she stopped for me. At that point, Marilyn Cross laughed and told me it was no problem. But she did say that was what I got for dipping my toes into the dating pool. I couldn't have agreed more. But I didn't agree when she said I should be finding a nice girl to settle down with. I agreed with the nice girl part, but settling down and getting married at 19 sounded like a nightmare. I only politely disagreed, and she laughed again, like she already knew I would. We kept driving while talking about this and that, and we had already established that I was headed to shallow water, and Marilyn Cross said she was going the same way. So when she turned off the highway and started heading straight east, I figured there had been some confusion at first. I reminded her where I was headed, and she said she hadn't forgotten. She just had to make a stop at a friend's place on the way back. Since she was giving me a ride out of the kindness of her heart, I wasn't about to complain about the pit stop. I kept up the small talk as we drove down a very dark dirt road. But when she suddenly stopped the car, the mood shifted completely. I asked Marilyn Cross why she stopped, but she didn't reply. She reached into the compartment of her door. The next thing I knew, there was a gun pointed at me. I froze at first, partly in fear and partly in complete disbelief. Marilyn Cross tossed a small sack at me, one made of black cloth, and told me to put it over my head. I thought it was a joke, just a really bad joke. I told her that this had to be a joke, but Marilyn Cross wasn't joking at all. She said I could either put the bag over my head or she would shoot me, call 911, and tell the cops that I tried to violate her. I was stunned again. It was a waking nightmare that had come out of nowhere. I couldn't find the words until she said, "Are you deaf? Put the bag over your head before I shoot you dead." I asked where she was taking me and what she planned to do with me. It was more an act of defiance than anything else. I knew she was not going to tell me. It was all just a way to delay the inevitable. Then, when Marilyn Cross told me one more time to put the bag over my head, I did what I was told. Once my face was covered, and I was almost completely blind, Marilyn Cross got us moving again. I kept asking where we were going and what she was going to do with me. But whenever she spoke, Marilyn Cross only said things like, "Shut up, demon. I ain't got ears for none of your lies." And she kept calling me that, a demon. When we stopped the car and she ordered me out, I could not see where I was walking, but she kept the gun pressed to my back until I realized we had walked inside somewhere. The next thing, she told me to put my arms out, and she tied my wrists around some kind of metal support that felt cold against my skin. After that, she took the hood off, and I could see that I was in a barn. Marilyn Cross told me if I did anything funny, she would kill me when she came back. Then she left the barn for what felt like forever, before returning with what looked like her younger daughter or something. She still had the gun pointed at me as she told her child how I was a demon and how if they both said a prayer, I would reveal myself as the monster I was. The whole time I tried to reason with her, telling her I was a good person and I said my prayers too, things like that. But Marilyn Cross kept telling her daughter things like, "Now hear that? Those are the devil's lies, and we don't have ears for the devil's lies, do we, sweetie?" She had that kid trained pretty well. She barely even looked at me, just kept her eyes on her mama, nodding yes or no whenever she was asked a question, like, And you know what we do with demons, don't you, sweetie?
That's right.
We destroy them. Then both of them started praying together. And no matter how much I begged them to see some sense, they would not listen. When I got louder, they got louder, until we were all screaming so hard, it seemed impossible that no one could hear us. But no one could hear us. And so, no one came to help me. And when I was done screaming and Marilyn Cross was done praying, she told her daughter to look at me and see the demon that had been revealed. That kid saved my life because she took one look at me, crying and begging for my life, sobbing, and said, "I don't see a demon, Mommy." Now Marilyn Cross responded, "Of course you do, sweetie. Look harder." But her kid just shook her head and repeated herself. And I will never forget the look on that woman's face when she gave me a kind of second look, like she was seeing me for the first time all over again. She looked like she was studying me, then she looked very surprised, and then finally she looked very sad. She turned to her kid and said something along the lines of, "Mommy made a mistake." And I joined in, yes, a mistake, as if that was all that had happened, because everyone makes mistakes. "Please let me go. Please let me go." But again, Marilyn Cross did not seem to listen. Her little girl's eyes were fixed on me, wide and afraid, but glassy, like she was right on the verge of tears. But Marilyn Cross did not look, not at first. She just kept saying how sorry she was before offering to take her back inside. I had to wait another God knows how long before Marilyn Cross showed up again, still holding that gun and with a black bag in her hand. I felt a deep sense of relief when I saw the bag, because I knew it meant she was going to drive me someplace again, or maybe walk me someplace. Either way, she was not going to shoot me, though that did not mean she did not threaten to. She gave me a long speech about how she was doing God's work out there, and how sometimes she made mistakes in identifying demons or devil worshippers. She said she was very sorry for what she had put me through, but she also said she could not leave me alone unless I promised not to tell anyone about what she had done. Right there, with either the gun or the black bag on offer, I would have said just about anything she asked me to say. So I promised her, and I promised God that I would never breathe a word of what happened that night to another living soul. Then Marilyn Cross put the bag back over my head, untied my hands, and directed me back toward her car. And the next time she took the bag off my head, we were on a dark stretch of highway that I could not identify. Marilyn Cross said it was roughly where she had picked me up, and as much as I could not be sure, I was too relieved to be out of that barn and out of her car to give a good goddamn where I was exactly. And before she drove off, she actually said, "God bless you," and explained how God would reward me in heaven if I kept my mouth shut. Well, I didn't keep my mouth shut. After I walked all the way back to Shallow Water, I called the county sheriff and filed a report. I knew it wouldn't be an open and shut case, obviously, but the cops got back to me, and the prognosis was probably worse than I expected. Without any witnesses or anything like that, any kind of legal proceeding would turn into a case of he said, she said, and Marilyn Cross's version of events was completely different from mine. It wasn't just that they differed, they varied wildly. She claimed she did the Christian thing by giving me a ride home, and that I tried to take advantage of her after stopping at her house so she could give me something to eat. She said I was drunk, which admittedly I was, and the fact that I'd been partying beforehand would look really bad if it were ever put in front of a judge, and on the off chance they did manage to pin a charge on her, it likely wouldn't be anything serious like kidnapping. If she convinced a court that she feared for her life, they might not even convict her of reckless endangerment, and she could just walk. In the end, the best advice the cops gave me was, don't get in cars with strangers anymore. To spare myself the stress, I chose not to press charges. Needless to say, I had one hell of a story to tell Lena Morales, and she thought it was insane not to move forward. That was true, until I explained how it could drag my name through the mud. If I tried to get Marilyn Cross locked up, which wasn't even her real name, she could counter by claiming I was just some drunk pervert who attacked her after she showed me kindness. This was right on the cusp of MySpace getting big too. The idea that people could look me up and decide I was some kind of predator felt like a second nightmare, one I still had the power to avoid. Sometimes I regret that choice, especially when I think about her doing the same thing to other people. I get a sick feeling in my stomach, wondering if some of them didn't get to walk away. That wasn't the first time religion had almost gotten someone killed in my family. I'm Italian-American on both sides of my family, and my dad's side has lived in Brooklyn since the 1930s. My grandfather, Luca, came over on a ship when he was still in his 20s, and as long as I knew him, he was the most deeply Catholic man I had ever met. He carried rosary beads with him everywhere. He never missed Mass or confession, and he sprinkled holy water in his bedroom every night to protect himself from evil spirits while he slept. But there was one part of his faith he paid little attention to, and that was the obligation of pilgrimage. My maternal grandmother always prided herself on her visits to the sanctuary of the Madonna Dorito and Monte Sant'Angelo. But Grandpa Luca had absolutely no intention of returning to Italy for any reason whatsoever. During one of the many conversations I had with him, I asked him why that was. Why a man so proud of his culture and cuisine could be so averse to seeing his homeland again. He replied that as much as there were things he disliked about America, it was a new place where the things of the old world could not follow him. I was never quite sure what he meant by that, whether it was heartbreak or debt or the mafia that drove him to America. But one day, when I was old enough, he decided it was time to actually tell me a story, and I understood why he had stayed so quiet about it in the past. Born in 1911, Grandpa Luca was 11 years old when Mussolini and his fascists came to power. He grew up in a very poor area of southern Italy, a place where the fascists had a lot of support. So when Grandpa turned 17, he was proud to enlist in a very prominent paramilitary organization. I do not want to turn this into a full history lesson, so I will not go into too much detail about which organization Grandpa joined, but it was a very brutal, very fanatical one that ran its own secret prisons on behalf of the state. As a dictatorship, the government had to make many people disappear in order to hold on to power. But they also needed places for those people to disappear into. That was how they ended up setting up their own secret prisons across the Italian countryside. My grandpa was young and eager to do his part for his country. He never imagined himself guarding jail cells filled with artists or poets, but he never complained either. When he proved himself capable, he was transferred to a place where more dangerous prisoners were held. These were not only prisoners of conscience. Some were hardened partisans who had taken up arms against the state, but there were other kinds of prisoners as well. One of the ways the fascists maintained their grip on power was by partnering with the Catholic Church. This partnership came with conditions. The Church was expected to tell everyone that Mussolini was a good man. In return, the fascists would use their power to crush the Church's enemies. The Catholic Church defined those enemies as religious cults. When I first heard the word cult, I thought of the Branch Davidians at Waco, or Jim Jones and his followers drinking the Kool-Aid in South America. But we only ever heard about the worst religious cults, and there were some that were not nearly so sinister. A religious cult might form around a particular saint, for example, or a group might practice mild forms of flagellation. The latter was tolerated if it was sanctioned by the Church, but if it was done without strict adherence to doctrine or without explicit permission, it was considered a grave sin. And no matter how much they might have wanted to, The Catholic Church could not simply arrest and detain people for committing sins. That was where the fascists came in. They were thugs willing to get their hands dirty. Instead of poets, artists, or resistance fighters, Grandpa found himself guarding the cells of gentle old priests or harmless hermits who were seen as threats to the church's control. Almost every day, some harmless old eccentric was dragged in, broken and bleeding. Every single time, my grandpa wondered why. Then came the day they dragged in a man with no name. After that, Grandpa did not wonder anymore. Even the most withered and isolated hermits would give a name when beaten hard enough. This man, stick-thin with long black hair, only said, "I don't have a name." Even after time in the prison's torture chamber, he refused. Because he was said to lead one of the more sinister cults I mentioned earlier, one that practiced ritual slaughter on All Hallows' Eve, he was considered extremely dangerous. Unlike most prisoners held in large communal cells, the man with no name was kept in constant solitary confinement. For the first time, Grandpa Luca understood why. The man with no name carried a dark, almost nauseating aura. It was said he had done terrible things as the leader of his cult. For the first time in many years, Grandpa understood the need for such strict security, and he was glad for it. The prison was a brutal and unforgiving place, but like any prison, those in charge needed ways to keep the inmates calm. They were allowed cigarettes. They were allowed to play soccer. They were allowed to put on plays or shows, as long as they were not political. Aside from a handful of fascist-approved titles, prisoners were not allowed any books, and they were not allowed writing materials. They were, however, allowed chess sets, playing cards, and other simple distractions. Prisoners in solitary confinement were no different. They also needed mental stimulation to prevent restlessness, and that was how the guards came to honor an odd request from the man with no name. He did not accept any of the books, cigarettes, or playing cards offered to him, and he seemed content to stare blankly at the wall of his cell all day. But this made the guards worry that he was losing his mind. So they asked if there was anything they could bring him to keep him occupied. Some prisoners asked for a ball to bounce, and others asked for a Bible. But in the case of a man with no name, he asked for a rock and a strip of sandpaper to shape it with. The request made it all the way up to the warden, who decided there was no harm in allowing the prisoner such objects, so long as nothing sharp or bladed was given to him. And so, that same day, a guard stopped by his cell and gave him a rock and some sandpaper. And over the next few weeks, the man with no name began shaping that rock. Guards would stop by his cell every so often to check on him or to deliver his daily bread and water, and they would see his progress. They saw how that the worked piece of stone was smoothed down and then worn away in certain sections until it became smooth and shiny all over. And then, right around the time the rock grew very smooth and oblong, like an almost oversized pill, the general prisoner population became more and more rowdy. They were making demands about exercise and food, saying they needed more of both, and that they were going to riot. Guards beat unruly prisoners mercilessly if they attacked each other, and denied food to those who attacked guards. But nothing seemed to calm their tempers, and the unrest grew worse and worse. Every night the prisoners would gather in the courtyard where they normally played soccer, and they would chant slogans about a free Italy. The guards had tried everything except shooting the prisoners to calm them down, and the warden still only had the mandate for a prison, not a death camp. So they could not simply shoot anyone who refused orders, but nor could they continue with the beatings and starvation, because those kinds of punishments only made the general population more violent. Instead, the warden tried to make a deal with them. On All Hallows' Eve, the night before Halloween, the warden gathered the prisoners to make an announcement. If they stopped demonstrating, he would arrange a delivery of fresh bread to the prison, along with several cases of good wine, so each prisoner could have a full cup to themselves. I suppose they considered that the nuclear option, the thing that would have put the demonstrations to rest. But to the warden's surprise, the offer did nothing to ease the unrest. I suppose the warden grew angry that the prisoners rejected his offer, so he went right back to offering beatings and starvation, only twice as much. But this not only caused another demonstration, it escalated into a full-scale prison riot. Grandpa said that he had never seen violence like it before or since. He said it was as if the prisoners were in a rabid frenzy, that they were not only attacking prison guards and trying to tear the prison itself apart, but they were killing each other as well. Prisoners who had once been friendly with each other were now literally at each other's throats, ripping one another apart with their bare hands. It was chaos, pure blood-soaked chaos. And the prison guards had no choice but to withdraw, surround the prison, and kill anyone who broke out and tried to escape. All night long the riot lasted, from dusk until dawn. But only a single prisoner breached the outer wall, only to be shot by the waiting guards. The next morning, the guards walked back into the prison and were greeted by a scene from a nightmare. There were dead bodies lying all over the prison courtyard, and there was so much blood that it had formed large puddles across parts of the yard. Most of the prisoners were back in their cells, either completely exhausted, terrified out of their minds, or nursing severe wounds. Most were accounted for in one way or another. But once they completed their body count, the guards realized someone was missing, and there was no time wasted figuring out who, because only one cell was empty. The cell belonging to the man with no name. Grandpa corrected himself after saying the cell was empty, because that was not strictly true. It just did not have anyone living inside it. Lying on the floor of the cell, in a pool of his own blood, was a prisoner, one who had no apparent connection to the man with no name. His heart had been torn out, ripped clean from his chest, and the man with no name was nowhere to be found. The guards searched the prison from top to bottom, certain the man had to be hiding somewhere, but they could not find him. And in the end, they were forced to accept that somehow the man with no name had escaped. Grandpa said a major investigation followed, because the warden was convinced the man could not have escaped without the assistance of a guard. He said one of them was either a member of the man with no name's cult, or had been bribed or threatened into helping him escape by the man's acolytes. Grandpa said all of them were dragged into interview rooms and threatened with imprisonment or worse if they did not confess. But not a single guard showed any sign of being involved, and the warden was forced to reach an alternative conclusion to save his skin. The official report stated that, to the best of the warden's knowledge, the man with no name had died during the riot, and that his remains were too badly mutilated to be properly identified. This was far more acceptable to the warden's superiors, because he would not be forced to explain that the man had simply vanished. But vanished was exactly what the guards believed had happened. They were just required to keep their mouths shut about it. And that was not the only thing they had been ordered to stay quiet about. Some of the guards began saying that the unrest only started after the man with no name took to shaping his stone, and that it grew worse and worse as the rock became smooth, and then began to take form. One guard added that on the morning of October 31st, the man finally completed his small project. He had turned the worked piece of stone into a small but perfectly formed figure of a man. And hours later, the demonstrations turned violent. The warden's offer was rejected, and the terrible slaughter began. Such matters were forbidden from discussion, and the guards were not permitted to leave or transfer their posts, in case anyone suspected that the warden's version of events was anything less than truthful. Grandpa realized that if he wanted to escape his life as a prison guard, he would have to escape the entire country. And that was exactly what he did. He went AWOL, smuggled himself into France, and by the first week of December, he was on a ship bound for New York. He spent his first Christmas in New York alone, unable to speak English. But he did not mind, because America was a place where the things of the old world could not follow him. One day, right at the start of the term, we had a child in my class whom I will call Arrive. Arrive was from a non-English speaking country, and although communication was difficult at first, extra English lessons helped him a great deal. It only took a couple of weeks before his personality began to shine through. Arrive also came from a place that did not celebrate Halloween, at least not in the way it is commonly done in the West today. So when September turned into October and Halloween decorations started appearing, the level of enthusiasm around it clearly surprised him. Arrive came from a very conservative culture, one that took ghosts, ghouls, and witches quite seriously. Because of that, he found the whole thing frightening at first. Once it was explained to him that it was meant to be harmless fun, and that people were turning scary ideas into something less threatening, he slowly began to understand the appeal. The children in my class made me proud that term, because they welcomed Arrive with open arms. They asked a lot of awkward questions about his accent and his background, but only in the honest way children often do. There was nothing I would have described as bullying. As they got to know him better, Arrive became fairly popular. Around Halloween, some of them took it upon themselves to teach him all about it. They told him about vampires, zombies, and werewolves. The creature Arrive found especially fascinating was Dracula. When I asked him why, he said he liked the idea of staying awake all night and being able to turn into something that could fly, like a bat. It was endearing to watch him bond with his classmates while overcoming his fears at the same time. His enthusiasm for something new also did wonders for his English. It was a little strange that some of his first advanced words were things like undead and transformation. But whatever helped seemed worthwhile. Halloween that year fell on a Friday, and after lunch, my class decided to dress up. We put on masks, makeup, and costumes, and ended up laughing through an unplanned Halloween party. Arrive wore a pair of plastic fangs I had bought and used a torn trash bag as a cape. He spent the entire time sneaking around and hissing at the other children from behind the shiny black plastic. They loved it, and once again, he was a pleasure to watch. At the end of the day, he insisted on going home still wearing the cape and fangs. That weekend, I told my boyfriend about it and agreed that Arrive sounded like a genuinely nice kid. So when Monday morning came, I was eager to see whether his little vampire act had lasted through the weekend. But Arrive was not in class that morning. We had the headmaster call his family at home to find out where he was, and only then did we learn that he was sick. The headmaster asked his parents to make sure they informed us of any illness in the future, and they said, "Sure, fine, no problem." And that was that. The next morning, Arrive still had not returned to school, so the headmaster called his family again to ask for an update. Their English was not very strong, but they could communicate well enough to say that Arrive still needed bed rest and would return to school as soon as he was able. Again, this was no problem. But after he failed to show up all week and then missed the first 2 days of the following week, we began to worry. The headmaster placed a third call to Arrive's family, and after receiving the same response that he was sick and needed bed rest, he asked if they had taken Arrive to a doctor. His parents said no. They had not taken him to a doctor, but the reasons for not doing so were lost in translation. That was the first time the words social services entered the conversation, and things escalated from there. A full 2 weeks after Arrive had been absent from school, a social worker knocked on the door of his family's home. The same conversation played out again, with the social worker being told that Arrive was sick. When she asked if she could come inside to see him, Arrive's parents refused. The social worker said she had the authority to return with a police officer and that they could be arrested if they continued to deny her access to Edive. But either they did not understand what she was saying, or they did not care. In an ideal world, the police would have gone to the house immediately to perform a wellness check. But red tape meant the social worker could not secure a specially trained member of the community outreach team until a full 3 weeks after Edive's initial absence. Only then were they able to access Edive's family home, and what they found inside must have shaken them to their very foundations. Edive was lying in his bed, nothing more than skin and bones. There was evidence his family were trying to take care of him, but he was still dangerously ill. So, after an ambulance was called, Edive was rushed to the hospital. Upon his arrival, there was a frantic effort to find out what was wrong with him, because he truly was on death's door, so painfully thin. But the doctors soon figured out why he was so sick. Edive hadn't eaten in nearly 3 full weeks, and had only been given the bare minimum of water to keep him alive. Once they realized it was a case of starvation, Arrive was slowly nursed back to health, and the police moved to arrest his parents. But from what I heard, Arrive's parents behaved unlike any the police officers had dealt with before, at least when it came to child neglect cases. They seemed like good, hard-working, honest-to-God people. They were absolutely devastated that their son was so ill. But when the police asked why Arrive was so malnourished, his parents couldn't understand what the problem was. In their view, they'd done exactly what a local holy man had advised them to do, which was to feed Arrive as little as possible in order to starve the demonic spirit they believed had possessed his body. I can only imagine how stunned everyone was when they heard Arrive's parents say that. But say it, they did. They were completely steadfast in their belief that their son was possessed by a demonic entity. And the first clue they said they had gotten was his sudden and intense interest in the macabre. They went to that local holy man I mentioned, and he gave them his assessment, after which they did what they thought was best for their son. But in reality, it almost killed him. During the 3rd week, when Arrive was really starting to waste away, his parents arranged for the holy man to come over so he could give an exorcism. I don't think it was the kind you see in films, with holy water being thrown everywhere and people shouting in unison. But they did something, some kind of ritual meant to drive demonic forces from Arrive's small body. From their perspective, it didn't work. So the starvation diet simply continued. Hearing all of that was easily the most frightening and shocking thing I'd heard in my career, and nothing has topped it since. The thought of that poor little boy lying in that bed, wasting away while believing there was a demon inside him. It breaks my heart just as much as it sends a shiver down my spine. Arrive's parents ended up going to prison, not for long, but I know they received custodial sentences, while Arrive went to live with a foster family in another part of the country. I'd been looking forward to seeing him that Monday morning to see if he was still obsessed with Dracula. I had no idea that I was never going to see little Arrive again.